Hello, it's Tony Blazer back with another video here for the Motocross Vault. And what I'm going to do in this one is take a look at one of my classic magazines back here. And for this one, I'm going to take it back all the way to the very beginning with the June 1971 issue of Dirt Bike magazine. Now, that is the first issue of Dirt Bike, a magazine that's still being produced today, at least for now. Hopefully, it'll keep going for a few more years. The way the magazine industry is going, though, you never know. It was produced then, and it still is, by High Torque Publications. Originally, the first editor was a guy by the name of Rick Siemens, and he was also known as Super Hunky, which is probably what most people know him by. He edited the magazine for the first 3-4 years, then went to a magazine called Popular Cycling for a few years, and then came back in the early 80s. Super Hunky was known for his fighting for riding in the deserts, riding for the right to ride. Also well known for his kind of biting prose. He was got himself in hot water a few times with some early tests where he kind of called it like he saw it and called some bikes pieces of crap if he thought they were pieces of crap. I was really not into motocross at this point. I was born in '69, so I was only 2 years old when this came out. So I didn't get my first magazine until 1982, 83, something like that. I really started getting into it when I was in my early teens. But I've gone back and acquired a lot of these magazines. I actually got this from Super Hunky himself. He sent me, I got a bunch of magazines from him a few years back. So this is, I'm going to go, page by page as I've done in the previous ones. I got to be honest, though, I'm not probably going to have as much to add because in the stuff in the 80s, I was really into it. Some of these brands I don't know anything about. But because this is such an important magazine, being the very first one and really the start of the motocross industry in terms of coverage at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of stuff out there. Most of the magazines would have been street-based in 1971. It's an important magazine and one that at least the old guys might appreciate. If you're a younger person, maybe you might look at this a little bit and see what things used to be like. You'll notice there wasn't a lot of color photography and things were a little different then for sure. Hope you enjoy this. If you like it, make sure you subscribe and ding that little bell to get notified when we post a new video. If you share it on social media and like this video, I'd really appreciate it. It helps me grow the channel a little bit, and I'll do some more if you like it. Let me know. I do read the comments, so feel free to drop me one. And here is the very first issue of Dirt Bike magazine. All right, here on the cover of the very first issue of Dirt Bike, you have a couple of guys riding. I can't tell what kind of motorcycles they are, really. You'll notice the style, though, is very kind of telltale of the early 70s, late 60s. At the time, suspension was pretty crude, and you would notice that even the top guys would land rear wheel first. It was kind of the preferred method. If you were to nose it in on one of these old bikes, you probably were going to go over the bars or snap the front end off the motorcycle. So even though today we would consider that kind of a goon riding style, that was not uncommon. I will say it's pretty interesting as well that this gentleman has a full-face helmet. And you consider in 1971 you had guys riding full-face helmets, and in 1989 you had Jeff Ward still running an open face. My first helmet was a hand-me-down Bell open face, and I rode with that for a while before I could afford to get my own. But it wasn't. I had nothing against it. I always wanted the most protection I could. So I just find it interesting these guys didn't value their faces very much in the old days. You'll see here in the coverage, Motocross, 2 words. A lot of these early magazines, it's kind of hyphenated, which I find interesting. And you'll see in the shootout, it's 3 European bikes, a CZ, Husky, and a Mako. The Japanese had not yet really invaded motocross at all. Honda was still 2 years away from its first Elsinore. Yamaha had a DT1, but it was really like a dual sport bike that some people modded to make a motocross bike. Kawasaki had some early stuff, and Suzuki was... they were racing quite successfully on their works bikes, but the production TMs weren't anything to write home to mom about. So you'll see these early dirt bike magazines and stuff, they focus much more on the European scene than they do a few years later after this. On the inside cover of the magazine here, you have an ad for a Rickman Matisse, which was a motorcycle made by a couple of British brothers by the name of Don and Derek Rickman. They had been actually professional riders in their own right, rode for the Motocross des Nations teams for Great Britain in the 60s, and they had developed a chassis for motorcycles under the Rickman name. Now, the thing that's interesting about these is the fact that it was kind of a bring your own engine kind of deal. They developed the chassis and you'd cram your own engine in the thing, so they could have BSA power plants or some other thing you'd cram in there. The name Matisse apparently is a Gaelic expression for mongrel, which is clear from the idea of you're taking a couple different things and making it into one, like a mongrel dog. Obviously, I never rode one of these bikes, but I do understand that they had quite a excellent reputation at the time. They were real popular in the U.S., where people would take the Rickman chassis and turn them into race bikes. On the table of contents here, you'll notice that one interesting thing I said earlier Rick Siemens was the editor of this magazine. From looking for the first couple of issues, he's actually listed as the technical editor. A gentleman by the name of Swede Carlson is the managing editor, and John Hutter is the editor. Hutter, I'm sorry you say that. Now, by the September issue, which is I think the second issue, third issue of the magazine, Rick is listed as the editor. So I'm not sure what happened to these other guys internally. Obviously, they shuffle things around. It is kind of interesting though to notice that. This first one has not got Rick as the main editor. As you can see in the table of contents, we're going to have several more tests and a little bit of some technical stuff on front brakes and keys to cornering and yada 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 we'll get into here as we go with the magazine. Here on page 4 and 5 we have the checkpoint column by John Hutter. Sorry if I'm butchering your name there, I apologize. In this column, he's basically talking about the genesis of Dirt Bike Magazine, how, as I was saying earlier, most of the magazines at the time were focusing on street bikes, magazines like Cycle World, Cycle Guide, Popular Cycling. I think Cycle World's still around, which is pretty cool, but almost all those other magazines are gone at this point. This was really the first magazine to kind of focus on the off-road industry, off-road people exclusively here in the U.S. There might have been some in the U.K. or someplace else where motocross was certainly bigger over in Europe than it was in the U.S. at this point. But this was kind of the one that really kicked things off. As I said, it's interesting that John here is only in the first couple of issues. By issue 3, he is no longer the editor. And by issue 4, he's gone completely. There's not in the column. I don't know what happened to him. I've never heard of the guy. I don't know if it was an issue where he moved to a different sister publication or there was a falling out. I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out now. On the next page, we have an ad for Big Bike Magazine. Subscription would run you $6.99 in 1971. As you'll see, there's a lot of street bike ads in this thing. As we said earlier, that the dirt bike industry wasn't nearly as big in 1971 in terms of aftermarket sport and magazines and everything else. It was still very fledgling, so a lot of the ads in here are for street bike stuff. Cruisers were big in the early 70s with the success of Easy Rider and what have you, so everybody wanted to chop out their front end and stick a couple of ape hangers on their bike, and you could get a subscription for 12 months for the low price of $6.99. Here on page 6, we have the very first of Rick Siemens From the Saddle columns. I do find it interesting that 10, 15 years later, whenever I was reading Dirt Bike Magazine, this same photo was the one he was using from 1971. He kind of never changed it. I'm sitting on this CZ here. This first column is talking about the importance of being prepared for riding off-road in the desert and what have you if something goes wrong, and what a pain it is to track people down. It was a serious issue in 1971, as I'm sure it would be today. I saw people are crazy to go ride out in the middle of the desert at 100 miles an hour, and then if you cartwheel and break your bike, you're out in the middle of nowhere, nobody help you. It takes a different breed to ride in the desert for sure. On the right here on page 7, we have an ad for some magnificent color posters, although they're in black and white here in the magazine. As I said, most everything is black and white in 1971. Apparently choppers are really big. I never have understood the appeal of destroying the handling of your motorcycle by chopping the front end out, but I guess you want to look like Easy Rider and be cool. And maybe that one on the bottom right might be kind of interesting, the 74 wheeler. On page 8, we have a column by Scott Shafer talking about conservation and the importance of taking care of our riding areas, not tearing up the grass, or being cognizant of how we impact riding areas. Just imagine if these guys were transported to today and how limited our riding areas was. Because we think about, hell, like I said, I grew up riding in the 80s and 90s, and I think back of the heyday of all the places just around me here in Northern Virginia we used to ride that are now like shopping malls or office park areas. In the 70s, we think of that as the glory days, the Wild Wild West. There, everywhere out in the desert and all these areas in California and stuff were just open to riding. These guys would have a heart attack if they realized how bad it was today. And what he says then is still important today. It makes you wonder how many places there will be to ride for our kids to ride, 10, 20 years from now. It was certainly an important issue then, and gets even tougher these days. On page 9 here, we have an ad for Choppers Magazine. Clearly, if you had the posters on the previous page, you'd want to have a subscription to Choppers Magazine for only $6.66. Clearly, if you into choppers, you like the Sign of the Beast as well, which is very interesting. You can see from the ads, there really just isn't much dirt bike stuff here early in the magazine. It's almost all street bike stuff. So street bikes were big, choppers were big, and hopefully you had your subscription ready to see all the latest stuff in ape hangers at the time. On page 10, we have a rundown of some European updates by John Weed. A gentleman by the name of Sammy Miller is retiring from World Trials competition. The gentleman they call the Maestro, I guess, had been quite a star in this sport up until this point. I never followed Trials any great deal. I've never heard of him, to be honest. Trials is one of those funny things where it really was very popular in the 70s, apparently. You see a prominent position for Trials in like movies like On Any Sunday. In the mid 70s, you had Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, all of them producing Trials bikes. Kind of surprising. It was like really popular for a little bit, but then within 2 or 3 years, they'd all discontinued them. So even now, it's kind of a niche sport, and I don't know, caught fire, I guess. Another interesting thing you'll notice: look at this guy; he's not wearing a helmet. You see, you watch like on any Sunday, these guys are like they're riding with their little, hats, like they're going to drive their Triumph Roadster home. Apparently, you can't crash and hit your head on a rock at 5 miles an hour. I'm not sure why they didn't wear helmets, but anyway, any case, Jeff Smith, who's, if you're familiar with old school motocross, was a kind of a really, really great rider in the 60s on the big four strokes before the transition to two strokes. He was making a little bit of a return here at the age of 36 in 1971, and surprisingly came to America and whooped everybody on a 250 BSA in the Trans AMA series. Now, in and of itself, the Americans weren't great. The fact that a world champion could beat us, probably not that surprising, but you certainly don't think of these old four strokes in the 250 size as being particularly competitive. The big 500s, yes, for sure. Although by this point the two strokes has certainly superseded them, but a 254 stroke, man, you just didn't see that much. Even then, it was hard to make that kind of real power out of a small four stroke. Even then. Another interesting thing you'll see is most of the brands we're talking about here don't exist anymore. Greaves gone, AJS gone, BSA would be gone shortly after this. Once the Japanese got involved, it really clobbered the crap out of all these European brands. One little last side note. At the bottom right here on page 11, you'll see they're talking about the Russians starting to get involved in motocross. And you'll find out that at this point, CZ was producing motorcycles. They were certainly popular. The Russians didn't have a Russian brand. I think they're talking about maybe riding a Voloskov, or I've never even heard of that thing before. But the Russians would eventually get it figured out and actually win several world motocross titles in the 70s, riding KTMs. Gennady Mosiev, I believe is how you say it. Pardon me, I'm not Russian, so it's hard to say, but he would end up being quite a successful rider in the 70s for the Russians, and like I said, they would end up being a motocross power there for a few years. Pretty impressive, really. All right, next up, we have another editorial. These guys had a lot of editorials back then. Seems like every editor on the staff had to write something. This one's by Swede Carlson. Cool name. It's covering kind of the same old ground a little bit. It opens up with a talk about old versus young and how, when you get old, you forget you were young and yada yada, kind of the same old thing there. But it kind of, I wouldn't say devolves, but goes into the root of the question is about the desert again and protecting our rights to ride out there in the desert. This clearly was a huge concern to these guys out in California. I'm sure it still is now, although, like I said, I'm sure a lot of it's probably closed down. You always see these they had things in the early, maybe the late 70s, the Phantom Duck of the Desert, and these guys who were fighting the ecologists, people like the Sierra Club trying to close down the desert. And I know Rick Seaman and all the guys at Dirt Bike are really always into all that stuff, and it was a huge fight. I live in the East Coast, so it was never a concern to me, other than the fact that obviously if there are fewer places to ride, there are fewer guys to ride dirt bikes, fewer bikes being sold, and it hurts all of us. Next up was a article where they interviewed a guy by the name of Whitney Martino. Apparently he was on the ISDE or ISDT team that year, the International 6-Day Trial, and also was a Hare and Hounds racer. It's funny, I remember the 70s being desert racing and the International 6 Days being a bigger deal. Motocross, like I said, was still not really as central to American taste in the early 70s. Desert racing, I think, was by far more popular in general. Things like dirt track and desert racing were kind of the American sports, and motocross was like a European thing. So you see these early ones, dirt bike always obviously carried a lot more of that off-road stuff than motocross action or anybody else did. But like I said, I've never heard of this guy. I don't know if he was great. I suppose for his time he was good. One thing I will say is interesting in the article, Super Hunky and Hutter, however you say his name, were interviewing him, and he was commenting on his Husqvarna 400, how it had He wanted more power, and the guys were kind of amazed that they would want more power from a 400. And it's interesting when you ride these old bikes. There's some of them are pretty potent, but they're not like, oh my god. And it's funny how tastes change over the time. If you stuck one of these guys on a modern bike now, they'd be like, couldn't believe how powerful the damn thing was. But at the time, it's all relative, and you only know what you know. So apparently that was a pretty potent machine in its time, and this guy went pretty fast. But again, no offense, but I have no idea who the hell he was. On pages 16 through 19, we get an article on how to modify your Yamaha DT1 and AT1 to handle better. They're recommending lengthening the swing arm. As I said earlier, there really wasn't much of a motocross bike, quote unquote, market from the Japan at this time. They really didn't have anything that was much of an out of the crate specialty racer. You kind of had to take like one of these Yamaha Enduros or something like that and kind of make it into your own racer, mod the frame, put some better suspension on it or whatever, take the lights and stuff off. So there was quite an industry to turn these DT1s and AT1s into. Some guys turn them into desert racers. Some guys turn them into motocross bikes. They sold a kit called the GYT kit, which would bring up the power a little bit, give it a little more potent performance for motocross use. And if you're going to race it in the desert or go anywhere fast, you're going to want to lengthen the swing arm and extend that wheelbase a little bit. The stock bike was a decent handling bike for what it was, but it's like I said, it's really a dual sport by modern standards. Hardly what you would want to do is take a dual sport onto the motocross track, but back then it was pretty common. You take the lights off and add a few things, and you have a quote-unquote racer. So this Yamaha DT1 was a pretty modest machine in a lot of ways, but a really important one. It introduced thousands of young riders into the joys of motocross and off-road riding. So super popular bike at the time, and I could see why they would have articles on how to make it a little better. On page 20, we start Dirt Bike Magazine's first true comparison test. This one pits the 250 motocrossers from CZ, Mako, and Husqvarna together for a little bit of a mini shootout here. Now, this is pretty interesting in that they really don't come to a conclusion. It's one of those things that you still see today that always aggravates me. They can't really make a choice on who's best. At the end of this thing, it basically says any of them can win. Which always feels a little bit like a cop-out. I mean, yeah, of course, in motocross, the rider is the most important factor. So anybody could win. You put Ricky Carmichael on a piece of crap, yeah, he's going to win. But especially back then, I got to think there probably was one that was a little better than others, especially because bikes were very distinctive in the early days of motocross. They had very different personalities. I mean, you just look at these things. The chassis are completely different. Now you sit on one bike and it feels very similar to everything else, but these things are very different. It's interesting to see that like two of them use up pipes. One of them uses a down pipe. Some of those other curiosities I always thought was weird. Like, I assume it was done for performance reasons because I just got to think it makes it very vulnerable hanging down underneath the motorcycle. I had a Harley Davidson, two-stroke trail bike. I don't know, it was like a 78 or 79 or something, had that damn thing. And it would always get stuck on logs and stuff in the woods. I hated that downpipe. So I'm not sure why they went with it. Like I said, this is kind of before my time. A couple of interesting things about this thing. You'll notice that a couple of these motorcycles use air filters that are paper, which on a dirt bike is pretty crazy. It's like the filter you would get on your car. So the problem is if you get that thing wet, it's going to completely suck up water and shut up. So definitely not the hot setup if you're going to take it for a mud race. You also have one of these quirks of magazines at the time. Even up until maybe the early 80s, they would take these articles and you'd read 4 or 5 pages and then it would say continued on page such and such. So you'd have to flip all the way to the back of the magazine to read the rest of the article. I always thought this was unbelievably annoying. Something you don't see these days. I assume it was probably done, just figuring it probably to make you flip through some other ads in the magazine, because now you had to flip like 5 or 6, 7 pages to find the rest of the article. So I assume that's what it was done for. It was very annoying, and thank God they got away from that eventually. On pages 30 and 31, we get a article extolling the virtues of using the front brake by Super Hunky. This is as true today as it is as it was in 1971. The majority of your braking force is always going to be on the front wheel due to the weight transfer when you're under deceleration. As you can see here on the bottom right, these forks with very limited travel probably could be bottomed out pretty easily. They're talking about how even well set up suspension can bottom under braking. Clearly, Rick Siemens had never tried a set of James Stewart's Supercross Forks, but on that CZ there, I don't think it probably would take much to bottom it out. On the next few pages, you have an article on a sidecar motocross machine. Now, this is one of those quirks of 70s motocross. You see a fair amount of coverage in the magazines about sidecar motocross. I have literally never watched a sidecar motocross. I don't know if this was like a really big thing, if you would actually see anybody locally racing sidecar. I always thought these guys were just nuts. Whether it be sidecar road racing or sidecar motocross, you have the racer and the monkey, I think is what it's called, the guy on the sidecar. I mean, who would sign up for this? I have no idea. It's crazy enough. I'll be damned if I want to get on the back of a motorcycle with somebody or on the sidecar on a motocross track. It just seems utterly nuts to me. But you do see a fair amount of coverage in these 70s magazines. It must have been one of those things that was popular for a little bit and then just kind of fizzled out over time. On page 36, Dirt Bike actually tests one of these Rickmans. This one is a Rickman Matisse Zundap. Now what that is, as I said earlier, was a conglomeration of several different parts from different machines. The Rickman part of it's the frame, the bodywork. The forks and shock were actually Serrani units, which were considered pretty high-end stuff at the time. The motor is out of a Zundap, which I got to be honest, I'm not sure who made Zundap. It's a 125 in this case. It's actually a very similar machine to the one I showed you at the beginning of the video. The one in the earlier part had, I believe, a BSA 4-stroke engine in it. But as I said, the motors are kind of interchangeable. You would buy the Rickman chassis and kind of stick your own motor in there. Now, this machine is considered beautiful by a lot of people. I think it's just downright hideous. The thing is just goofy looking to me. All this body work is fiberglass, which seems like a terrible idea on a motocross machine. That weird boat tail fender on the back is just a little bit strange. The front fender is stuck to the front wheel like a trials bike. Kind of reminds me of a Honda Reflex. Not sure who thought that was a good idea. The first time you hit some mud, it's going to pack solid and be completely worthless. They comment on all that and how fragile the fiberglass stuff is. The bike was pretty expensive. It was $900 at the time, which was a lot for a 125 in 1971. It was not an amazing machine from their test. Every shift had like a lot of false neutrals in it. The Zundap motor, I guess they said, had a fair amount of performance in it. But of course, by modern standard, I'm sure this thing was a totally slug. There's no reed valve, I wouldn't think. In 1971, it was pretty odd to have a reed valve in anything. Obviously, it's a air-cooled, no power valve, none of that stuff that would kind of help make a 125 have a little bit of broad power band. I'm sure you just kind of pinned it and hope for the best. Overall, a interesting machine. Check out the throw to the clutch here. It's got like a Paul Bunyan hand would need to be needed to grab that clutch. It's pretty crazy. In any case, like I said, a lot of people love these bikes. They think they're really cool. It's considered kind of a 70s collectible machine, but it's just never really been my cup of tea. Starting on page 40, we get an article on how to win at motocross. Now, this is certainly an article I probably should have read. Maybe I would have won more races, but it's covers some basic stuff about making sure your bike's okay. You go over it, make sure your sprockets are tight, don't have any loose spokes or anything between motos. Nothing really mind-blowing in terms of overall what they're talking about. As a little side note, there is a cool little photo here. If you look at the bottom right, that's actually Roger DeCoster. They say styling on a stock Yamaha DT1, which, as I said, is really like a dual sport bike. So he looks good even on this thing. I'm sure he probably snapped the thing in half when it landed, but it's pretty cool showing the man there. On the next page, you have a little bit of some race action with John DeSoto and his younger brother, Tim Hart, who would go on to, I believe, race for Factory Honda later. Some of these guys showing early on. Just basically talking about, preparing your bike, preparing yourself physically for the competition, getting mentally right, for motocross. Motocross is a pretty demanding sport. I think that's why so many of us love it. And even in 1971, even though it probably wasn't taken quite as seriously at some level, I'm sure every one of these guys, taking their bike out and competing was just as in tune with trying to win as we are these days, for sure. Next up is a test of Bultaco's 250 Matador. Now, this is a dual-purpose machine. Now, if you're not familiar with Bultaco, it was a Spanish brand that went under maybe the late 70s, I think. By the late 70s, I think they had already gone out of business. But they were a pretty popular machine in the early 70s. Certainly, you saw a lot of them. The Persang was like their motocross version. And this Matador is like a dual-purpose machine. And even in 1971, you had very different varieties of dual-purpose bikes. You had some of the stuff from Honda, which were really just street bikes with like up pipes and maybe like a crossbar handlebar. And then you had bikes like the DT1, which were actually a genuine off-road machine that you could take on the road. This per se was definitely more the latter. It would be comparable, I guess, to a modern KTM Dual Sport, mostly dirt, but still okay to ride on the street. They complain a little bit about the ergonomics are not really great for street riding. The seat was fairly low and the pegs are high, obviously, for off-road clearance and stuff. So it wasn't a great on-roader, but they said you could, a Novice could motocross it. It was decent enough for cross-country work and stuff like that. Well, so in that way, it was a, pretty ahead of its time. Today, like I said, that's a real popular segment. You see Honda kind of doing these competition dual sports, getting away from some of the more foofy ones and stuff. And this would definitely be more on that end as opposed to something you would have bought from like Suzuki or something at the time. They really like this machine at $900. It's fairly expensive for a dual purpose bike, but I've never ridden a Bull Taco. I understand some of them were pretty good machines, but like I said, they were out of business before I really was into motocross. This Kickstarter is a pretty weird looking thing. I always thought they were kind of funny the way they kicked way forward. I guess they didn't engage until you moved it back a little bit. I don't know. Just like I said, I've never ridden these or had too much experience with them. Some of them are pretty though. This one, for a dual sport, it's not a terrible looking bike for 1971 for sure. It kind of actually looks like a Honda a little bit. All right, our next test is for a motorcycle I literally had never heard of before, the MZ250. Now, that is probably just my ignorance because apparently MZ is a well-known brand in Europe. At the time, this was an Eastern European brand, which you got to remember that was still under the communist bloc at that point. I actually looked it up. The MZ stands for Motorrad Zwaarderwerk, which I'm sure is terrible. It's German, which stands for Motorcycle of Two-Wheeled Factory. I'd never heard of these, like I said. Apparently, they were pretty successful. It says in the article they've won several ISDEs. I guess their heyday was before I got into motorcycling, because I literally had never seen one, heard anything about it. Seems like a decent enough bike, although I will say it looks kind of like a street bike. It doesn't look like too sporty of a machine, to be honest. But, like I said, what the hell do I know? This is before my time, quite frankly. On pages 52 and 53, Rex McMasters writes an interesting article called The Novice, where they basically do a little interview with a local novice. Obviously, the majority of guys reading the magazine would have been, just gentlemen racers, not pros. So it's kind of cool that they acknowledge that in this little piece. They say they're going to do it month to month. I'm not sure how long this kept going. Certainly, it wasn't still in the magazine by the time I got around to start reading Dirt Bike. But it's a cool idea to give some local guy a little bit of press here. Nate's riding a DT1. As I said, those were kind of the ubiquitous motorcycle for a lot of people. I think so he took the lights and stuff off here and probably did a few mods and turned it into a gentleman racer. Definitely a popular machine, to be sure. Now, after this, we do a lot of little kind of housekeeping stuff. There's an article here on what breaks and what it costs to get the repairs, where they put a little table together here to see the different costs from the manufacturers and what it costs to fix the bike if something did go wrong. And then you start getting into these follow-ups to the articles that were started earlier. This on page 57 here, you have the follow-up, or not the follow-up, I guess, but really the conclusion is the word I'm looking for. The conclusion to the shootout between the 250s that were started 30 pages earlier. So you end up in the back of the magazine here with a bunch of little tidbits and ending segments to other articles that were started in the beginning columns and what have you. On pages 58 and 59, we get a really cool segment here where they went and highlighted local tracks around the country. Now, this particular one, this is a track called the Ponderosa, which is a mind-boggling 9 miles long. Which is just crazy. You would certainly not see any kind of a motocross course 9 miles long these days, land use being what it is. This track was located in Lancaster, California, and apparently it had a really cool layout, a lot of sand, whoop-de-doos, and they said it was a pretty punishing, torturous track. If you look at the diagram here, it looks pretty cool. I obviously never rode out there. I live on the East Coast, like I said, but it's pretty neat to see it. I know that not in this issue, but another one of the issues, they actually covered my local track, which is Budds Creek, the same track that they have the National on now. It's pretty neat to look at it back in 1971 and see what it was like back then. Certainly has changed a lot, but it was a cool segment, and like I said, one of those ones that They didn't really keep doing. I'm not sure how long they kept doing this for. Later, you'd see Motocross Action. Sometimes they would do segments where they talk about different tracks in different states. I always like that. This one, I'm not sure why they stopped doing it. Maybe they didn't get enough interest, or it was too much hassle. And once they ran out of the local California tracks, but definitely a neat idea for an article. I wish they had kept going with. On page 60 and 61, we have the conclusion of that Martino article from about 100 pages earlier. Like I said, they keep sticking the conclusion of these different articles and columns and what have you at the end of the magazine. On page 62, you have the conclusion of two other columns from earlier in the magazine. You have some really hideous Viking motocross boots by Bent Aberg. I have never seen these boots before. They don't look particularly awesome. I got to be honest. You got a Mako ad with Aki Janssen. In the next page, you have a little checklist to go over when you're going over your motorcycle and make sure everything doesn't fall apart on you. And Rick Siemens tricks and tips for the dirt rider. Talking about, I guess, early kind of the hot setup or something like that was similar to what like the Ask the M experts would be today with Motocross Action and stuff. Now, Roland Hines was, no, I'm sorry, not Roland Hines. Rondo Talbot was not in the magazine yet. I guess a couple of years after this is when you start seeing that Ask Mr. Know-It-All stuff. I'm kind of bummed that it wasn't in here from the beginning. On the last page here, you have an ad for Cycle Products West, which I don't remember being around. I would doubt it's still around. I have no idea. Al Wenzel looks like he signed this ad. I'm not sure who that is, but in any case, it'd be cool if they're still around, if they made it all these 50 years later. And on the back of the magazine here, we have an ad for Kawasaki's off-roaders. As I said earlier, at this time, the Japanese weren't really that into motocross. They had a fair amount of motorcycles, but you had like the Green Streak and some bikes that some people were using for TT racing and maybe trying to convert into motocrossers. But most of these bikes were not really made for that. These bikes here are dual sports, clearly, as you can see. They're bragging about their Hada forks, which, if I remember right from reading the tests of these things, were not the hot setup, not great forks at the time, but they surely seem proud of it. But all right, so there it is. We've reached the end of the very first issue of Dirt Bike magazine from 1971. If you like this sort of thing, check out the channel. I've done one for a few other magazines, issue of Motocross Action from 1989. I did all 4 issues of Inside Motocross, and maybe one more, I think, of Super Motocross as well. And if people like this, I'll do more. Like I said, I have thousands of magazines. It takes quite a while to go through them here and stuff. I'm not sure what everybody thinks of these, so definitely let me know your feedback. If you dig it, I'll do more. If people aren't into it, like I said, it's no hassle. It's a lot of hassle, so I don't want to do it if people don't dig it. So just let me know one way or the other. And until we meet again, keep the rubber side down. Peace.